José Luis was an anonymous shadow in the concrete labyrinth of Ciudad Nezahualcóyotl. At 30, his life was an exercise in invisibility, a calculated routine to avoid drawing attention in a place where visibility was an invitation to violence. Born and raised in the dusty, overpopulated streets that swallowed the horizon, he learned to navigate the urban jungle with eyes trained not to be seen, a hunched posture that apologized for its own existence. By day, he was just another face in the crowd, a factory worker whose silence was mistaken for submission. Little did they know that behind the facade of coldness and indifference there was a universe of contained emotions, an observant mind that registered every movement, every injustice, every look of contempt. He was a survivor, shaped by poverty and prejudice, waiting for the moment life would give him more than just the next sunrise. Before we dive into the hell his life would become, I need to ask for your help, because this channel only exists thanks to people like you, telling stories like José Luis's, which are often silenced or forgotten, is a mission that depends on your support. We have a goal of reaching 1,000 subscribers, so we can continue to give a voice to these complex and deeply human narratives. Please, if this story has already begun to touch you, subscribe to the channel and comment on where you're watching from. Every subscription, every comment is a brick in the foundation of this space, allowing the courage and pain of characters like him not to be in vain. Your support is what drives us and gives us the strength to continue sharing accounts that deserve to be heard around the world. José Luis's real life began when the door to his small apartment closed, isolating him from the chaos of Neza. There, in his partner's arms, the outside world with its homophobia and brutality dissolved. Their love was a sanctuary, a silent act of rebellion in a macho society that would crush them if it discovered their truth. Every kiss, every whispered conversation in the dim light was a treasure stolen from the oppressive reality that surrounded them. It was in this refuge that José Luis's cold mask fell away, revealing a vulnerable man capable of a deep and protective love. He didn't dream of power or wealth. His only desire was to preserve that small universe of peace, an oasis of tenderness in the middle of the desert of violence that was his hometown, a place that viscerally rejected them. The double marginalization he suffered, being poor and homosexual, had forged a shell of steel around him. Since childhood, he learned that any display of weakness or affection in public would be punished with mockery or violence. Prejudice was like the air he breathed in Neza, toxic, omnipresent, and suffocating. This constant need to hide, to repress his identity, fueled a silent rage within him. He saw the hypocrisy of the men who exalted brute force by day and unraveled in dark secrets. By night, this sharp observation made him a keen analyst of human nature, especially its weaknesses. He understood the power of fear and humiliation because he experienced them daily, not knowing that this bitter knowledge would one day become his greatest weapon. The presence of the local cartel was a constant shadow over the neighborhood. Led by a man known only as El Carnicero, the traffickers imposed their own law with sadistic brutality. José Luis and his partner lived under the yoke of this fear, moving with extra caution, knowing their very existence was an offense in the eyes of those men. They heard the stories, the whispers about the disappeared, about the bodies left as warnings. The danger was palpable, a tension that hung in the air, along with the pollution. José Luis felt this threat viscerally, and his protective instinct kept him in a state of permanent alert. He naively believed that if they remained invisible, the monster that roamed the streets of Neza would never find them, not realizing that fate had already written his name on tragedy's list. There was one night, a few weeks before the end, that would be etched in his memory as the last fragment of peace. They were in the kitchen, sharing a simple meal, while the city outside roared its usual fury. They talked about the future, a distant dream of moving to a coastal city, a place where they could walk hand in hand without fear. In that moment, under the yellowish light of the bulb, hope seemed possible, tangible. His partner smiled, a smile that lit up his tired face and promised a better tomorrow. José Luis cherished that image in his heart, the purest representation of everything he loved and wanted to protect. It was the last time he felt truly whole, a man whose world, however small, contained all the meaning he needed. José Luis prided himself on his intelligence and his capacity for control. He was a strategist of survival, analyzing every route, every schedule, every interaction to minimize risks. He believed he had built a fortress around his secret life, a system of precautions that would keep them safe from the violence that consumed so many others around them. This illusion of control was his defense mechanism, his way of fighting the powerlessness he felt against the oppression of Neza. He was observant, methodical, and calculating, traits that set him apart from the impulsive and brutal men who dominated his world. He underestimated, however, the random and irrational nature of evil, the chaotic force of cruelty that follows no rules and delights in destroying others' happiness just for the pleasure of it. The fateful morning began like any other. The sun rose, filtering through the grey buildings, and the city awoke with its cacophony of horns and street vendors. His partner got up to go to the market, a routine, mundane task. There was a goodbye kiss at the door, a whispered, "Be careful," as they always did. José Luis watched him from the window, a figure disappearing into the crowd, never imagining it would be the last time he would see him alive. The apartment fell silent, filled only by the hum of the refrigerator and the sense of normalcy that preceded the storm. It was in that silence, in that everyday peace, that José Luis's universe began to disintegrate piece by piece, with nothing he could do to stop the avalanche that was about to bury his soul forever. The hours dragged on with torturous slowness. The sun, which had once illuminated the promise of an ordinary day, now seemed to mock José Luis, sinking below the horizon and plunging the apartment into a gloom that mirrored the growing darkness in his soul. The untouched plate of food on the table, the silence that screamed of absence, everything became an omen. Every horn on the street made him jump. Every footstep in the hallway was a pang of hope, followed by a wave of disappointment. He called his partner's cell phone dozens of times, but each call went straight to voicemail, a digital abyss that echoed his desperation. The initial anxiety, an uncomfortable knot in his stomach, had transformed into an icy dread that paralyzed his limbs. The sanctuary had become a torture chamber, and the waiting, an unbearable agony. The night brought not the familiar sound of a key in the lock, but an anonymous message, a dry text with an address to a vacant lot in the most forgotten outskirts of Neza. A chill ran down José Luis's spine, a terrible certainty he tried to suppress as he ran through the dark streets, his heart hammering against his ribs. The scene was a nightmare born from the city's bowels, trash, rubble, and the rusted carcass of a car. And there, under the cold light of a lone streetlight, he saw him. His world stopped spinning. The body of his love was thrown down disrespectfully, marked by the brutality El Carnicero used as his signature. It wasn't just a murder, it was a statement of hatred, a performance of cruelty, calculated to humiliate, to violate not just a life, but the very identity of who he was. José Luis's scream died in his throat, a mute sound of pure agony. He fell to his knees, the dust and broken glass on the ground tearing at his pants. But he felt nothing. The world around him dissolved into a soundless, colorless blur. It was an absolute void, a pain so deep it transcended tears. Everything they had built, every whispered dream, every stolen moment of happiness had been erased with unspeakable violence. Neza, the monster he had always tried to avoid, had finally caught him and devoured his only reason for living. On that vacant lot, under the indifferent gaze of the stars, the old José Luis died along with his partner. The man who would rise from that ground would be someone else, a hollow shell filled only by memory and the echo of that devastating loss. As the initial wave of shock began to recede, something new and terrifyingly powerful started to bubble beneath the surface of his grief. It was when his eyes, once clouded with pain, focused on a specific detail, the way the body had been positioned, a direct and unequivocal insult to his sexuality, a sickening trademark of el carnicero. That detail lit the fuse. The overwhelming sadness began to mix with an incandescent fury, a rage so pure and intense it burned away the cold of despair. It had not been a random act of urban violence. It had been personal. It had been a punishment for loving, for existing. The pain did not disappear, but it transformed, solidifying into a purpose. The target of his suffering now had a name and a face. And José Luis's broken heart began to beat to a new rhythm. The rhythm of a revenge that would be as cruel as the crime that inspired it. He rose slowly, his body trembling no longer from pain, but from an icy resolve. The tears had dried, leaving behind the feverish glint of a silent promise. There would be no police, no justice from a system that had always treated them as invisible or disposable. Justice would be his, forged with his own hands. In that moment, looking at the destroyed love of his life, José Luis accepted his crown of thorns and decided that if he was going to bleed, he would drag all his tormentors to hell with him. It was there I understood there was no turning back. The path was set. If you have ever felt so crushed by injustice that you could no longer breathe, you know what I'm talking about. Subscribe to this channel, because the journey that begins now is that of a man who refused to remain the prey and decided to become Neza's most feared predator. The days following the burial were a blur of silence and dust. The apartment, once a refuge, was now a mausoleum of memories, each object a trigger for his pain. José Luis moved like a ghost through the rooms, the echo of his beloved's voice resonating in every corner. The pain, however, did not paralyze him. On the contrary, it sharpened him. He transformed it into fuel, into an armor of ice that encased his heart. Sadness gave way to a terrifying clarity, a lucidity forged in the fire of loss. He knew the path he had chosen was a one-way street, that to hunt the monster, he would have to descend into the abyss. Nezahualcóyotl had taken everything from him, and now he would use the city's own guts to build his revenge, brick by brick, body by body. His first step was not an act of violence, but of observation. He reactivated the skill that life had, forced him to develop, to be invisible, to hear and see everything without being noticed. He spent weeks mapping out El Carnicero's operation, identifying the drug spots, the collectors' routes, the safe houses. He wasn't looking for a direct confrontation, but a crack, a fissure in the wall of that criminal organization. He found it in the form of a small-time dealer, an arrogant and addicted young man who operated on a forgotten corner. That was his entry point. José Luis studied his weaknesses, his greed, his need to feel important. He prepared his new identity like an actor preparing for a role, a desperate man, willing to do anything for money. The approach was precise. He presented himself as a nobody, a man broken by the crisis, offering to do the dirty work no one else wanted, cleaning, watching, carrying small amounts. He played the part of the submissive, swallowing his pride and disgust as he served the men who represented everything he hated. His intelligence was his greatest weapon. Carefully veiled under a mask of mediocrity, he became useful, reliable, and most importantly, forgettable. No one paid attention to the silent servant who overheard every conversation, who memorized every name, who connected every piece of the puzzle. He was inside, a virus implanted in the system, waiting for the right moment to start corrupting everything from within. Before diving in completely, he sought out the only person who could understand, even partially, the dimension of his loss. La Flaca, a trans woman, his late partner's best friend. He found her in her small beauty salon, an oasis of color and glitter amidst the grey monotony of the neighborhood. The reunion was a clash of shared grief. La Flaca, with her wisdom forged in a lifetime of battles, saw the darkness in José Luis's eyes and tried to dissuade him, begging him not to let revenge consume him. However, she also saw the unbreakable determination, the soul that had already crossed the point of no return. With a heavy heart, she agreed to be his eyes and ears on the outside, his only anchor to sanity in that sea of madness. With the help of La Flaca's information, he identified his first target, one of the low-level sicarios who bragged about having participated in the kidnapping. The man was a creature of habit, frequenting the same bar every night to drink and boast of his cruelties. José Luis watched him for days, learning his routine, the path he took home through a dimly lit alley. The plan was not that of an experienced killer, but of a strategist. He didn't have the brute force, so he would use surprise and cunning. The preparation was a cold, methodical ritual, each step calculated to maximize his chances. He felt no fear, only a frigid calm, the tranquility of someone about to fulfill an inevitable purpose. The moment of the first kill was a watershed moment for his soul. The confrontation in the dark alley was not clean like in the movies. It was clumsy, desperate, and brutally intimate. There was hesitation, the ghost of the man he used to be fighting against the urgency of the man he had to become. But upon seeing the killer's face, the smug grin that haunted his nightmares, fury took control. The act was visceral. The raw, ugly violence left him breathless and covered in blood. In that instant, the line between justice and revenge dissolved completely. He had crossed the threshold, and the sound of his enemy's last breath was the echo of the end of his own innocence. He felt no remorse, only the emptiness of the first piece of a macabre puzzle falling into place. Returning to the apartment that night, felt as if a stranger had taken over his body. He scrubbed his skin raw in the shower, trying to wash away not just the blood, but the stain he felt on his soul. The silence was no longer one of mourning, but of complicity with what he had done. He looked in the mirror and saw a predator, the cold, empty eyes of someone who had taken a life. When La Flaca saw him the next day, she knew. No words were needed. The change was etched on his face, in his posture. She hugged him, a gesture of both comfort and farewell, for they both knew the friend she had known was disappearing, being replaced by something much darker and more dangerous. In the cartel, the sicario's disappearance was met with a brief wave of concern, soon dismissed as just another unpaid debt or a fight with rivals. No one suspected the silent servant. José Luis used the power vacuum to show himself as even more efficient, more loyal. It was during this period that his path crossed with that of El Cholo, an ambitious young sicario, loyal to El Carnicero, who embodied the organization's macho culture. El Cholo viewed José Luis with contempt, distrusting his quiet demeanor and making veiled jokes about his apparent lack of manliness. He was an obstacle, a guard dog of the system José Luis intended to destroy from within, and he treated him with the disdain reserved for inferiors. The dynamic between them changed during a delivery that went terribly wrong. A police ambush, shots flying from all sides, panic set in, and El Carnicero's men, used to being the hunters, found themselves cornered. El Cholo, with his impulsive courage, was about to lead a suicidal charge against the officers. That's when José Luis's strategic mind kicked in. With an unnerving calm amidst the chaos, he identified an escape route through a sewer system he had mapped. Out in his wanderings, he didn't shout, he just gave clear, precise instructions. His confidence and logic cut through the panic like a knife. El Cholo, initially skeptical, saw the logic in the plan and, with no other option, ordered the men to follow the servant. The escape was successful, saving the shipment and, more importantly, the lives of everyone involved. As they emerged into the safety of a hideout, El Cholo's gaze toward José Luis had changed. Contempt had been replaced by a reluctant respect. He had seen firsthand that intelligence and calm under pressure were more powerful weapons than brute force. That day, José Luis not only survived, he planted the seed of an unlikely loyalty, proving his worth in the only way that world understood, through results. From that moment on, El Cholo became José Luis's protector within the organization. He shooed away those who mocked him, ensuring that his authority, though informal, was respected. He saw in José Luis the mind that he lacked, the brains behind the brawn he could offer. An unlikely alliance was born from that baptism of fire, a symbiosis of strategy and raw power. José Luis now had a shield, an armed enforcer who gave him the freedom to move more boldly within the cartel's hierarchy. El Cholo's loyalty was genuine, based on admiration for his survival skills and a life debt he would take very seriously. With his new status and El Cholo's protection, José Luis aimed for his second target, one of L.E. Carnicero's lieutenants, the man who had ordered the kidnapping. This time, the approach would be different. Brute force wouldn't work against a well-protected man. It would be a character assassination, followed by a physical one. Using the information he gathered, José Luis discovered the lieutenant was skimming money from operations. He began planting evidence, manipulating records, creating a trail of betrayal that would lead directly to his target. He was playing chess while his enemies were playing checkers, moving the pieces on the board with deadly patience. The trap was set perfectly. José Luis arranged a meeting between the lieutenant and a supposed buyer from a rival cartel, ensuring the news reached El Carnicero's ears through reliable sources. Paranoia, ever present in the criminal world, did the rest. El Carnicero, furious at the betrayal, summoned the lieutenant to a meeting from which he would not leave alive. José Luis watched from a distance, from the shadows, as the monster himself eliminated one of his own generals. He didn't get his hands bloody, but the manipulation made him feel even more corrupt. He was learning to use the system's own evil against itself, a dangerously effective tactic. The rising tide of violence and disorder in Neza caught the attention of a new player, Detective Morales, a veteran, old-school cop, one of the few who couldn't be bought. Morales was smart and methodical, and he didn't see the killings as isolated crimes. He noticed a pattern, an intelligence behind the chaos that didn't fit with El Carnicero's thoughtless brutality. He began to investigate, to dig deep, becoming a silent, persistent threat that José Luis could not afford to underestimate. The city now had two hunters in its midst, one seeking revenge, the other seeking justice. The danger materialized when Morales showed up at the factory where José Luis kept his cover job. The visit was routine, a background check on employees in the area, but the detective's gaze was piercing. He asked casual questions, but his eyes analyzed every reaction, every micro-expression. José Luis felt a chill, the first drop of real fear since his journey began. He maintained his mask of a humble, disinterested worker, responding with rehearsed monotony. It was a silent duel of wits, and though Morales left with nothing concrete, José Luis knew he was on the radar of the one man in Neza who could unravel his plan. Meanwhile, within the cartel, José Luis's cunning did not go unnoticed by El Carnicero. Seeing him as the only competent survivor of the ambush and impressed by the discovery of his lieutenant's betrayal, the drug lord promoted him. He was taken off the dirty work and brought into the inner circle to help with planning and logistics. The irony was cruel. He was being rewarded for dismantling the organization he had sworn to destroy. He now sat in meetings with the remaining men who had participated in his lover's death, smiling and planning with them while secretly orchestrating the downfall of each one. Being so close to his final enemy was both nauseating and electrifying. Proximity to power, however, came at a steep psychological price. Every night when he lay down, his partner's smiling face would appear in his mind, but now the image was followed by flashes of the acts he had committed. The man in the mirror was a stranger with hard eyes and stained hands. La Flaca, in their rare and tense conversations, confronted him with this truth. "He wouldn't have wanted this for you," she would say, her voice choked with sadness. "You're becoming just like them." José Luis would push her away harshly, saying she didn't understand, that survival required sacrifice. But deep down her words haunted him, the echo of a conscience he fought desperately to silence. With El Cholo as his right-hand man and a growing number of low-level members who admired him for his intelligence and cold-bloodedness, José Luis began to build his own faction within the cartel. He didn't actively recruit. He simply attracted the disgruntled, those who were tired of El Carnicero's impulsive and brutal leadership and saw in José Luis a chance to prosper. He rewarded them, protected them, and above all, listened to them. He was creating a silent army, united not by loyalty to a name, but by belief in a leader who thought before he shot. The power was subtly shifting, and the king on the throne had not yet noticed the conspiracy growing at his feet. The next step was to find El Carnicero's ultimate weakness, and as José Luis had always suspected, it was intertwined with the very thing that defined him, his toxic masculinity and virulent homophobia. He discovered, through an informant, that El Carnicero's power depended on an alliance with a larger cartel, whose leader was a violent traditionalist who despised any sign of weakness. El Carnicero's homophobia wasn't just hatred, it was a performance to maintain his reputation and his alliances. José Luis smiled for the first time in months. He had finally found the perfect weapon to destroy his enemy, his own prejudice. The plan was audacious and perverse. He wouldn't just eliminate one, but two of El Carnicero's last trusted men in a single blow, and he would do it in a way that would tarnish his boss's reputation forever. Using his newfound authority, he sent the two lieutenants into a trap, a fake drug deal. There, instead of buyers, they were met by José Luis's loyal crew. What happened next was not a summary execution. It was a macabre theater designed to send a message. The bodies were found the next day, in a situation that suggested a homosexual relationship, a fabricated scandal designed to humiliate El Carnicero in the eyes of his allies and underlings. It was at this turning point, seeing the chaos he had sown, that José Luis consolidated his power grab. He called a meeting with the remaining captains, the men who were now scared and confused. With a glacial calm, he exposed the rot at the heart of the organization, the weakness of a leader whose closest men kept secrets that could destroy them all. He presented himself not as a traitor, but as a savior. It was there I realized, in the midst of that tension, that to truly win in a world of monsters, it's not enough to fight them. You have to take the crown. If you understand that need to turn the tables, to take control when all seems lost, support this story so it can reach more people. Subscribe, because what you'll see next is how a shadow rises to dominate the darkness itself. The reaction was immediate. The seed of doubt he had planted blossomed into a mutiny. Many, already influenced by El Cholo and tired of El Carnicero's tyranny, saw in José Luis a more stable and intelligent leadership. Others, the loyalists, remained faithful to the old boss, shocked by the audacity of the coup. The cartel split in two. The streets of Neza, once controlled by a single power, became the board for a civil war. Gunshots echoed through the night, and bodies began to appear more frequently as the two factions fought brutally for control of the territory. José Luis's personal vendetta had morphed into a conflict that bled across the entire municipality. El Carnicero, crazed with rage and humiliation, retaliated with the only tool he knew: brute force. He launched frontal assaults, sending waves of sicarios against José Luis's positions. But he was playing an old game. José Luis, on the other hand, was fighting a modern war. He didn't defend territories, he controlled information. He used his network of informants, his understanding of his enemy's psychology, and his intimate knowledge of the streets to set ambushes, to attack supply lines, and to turn El Carnicero's own men against each other. He was a guerrilla fighter against an army, and his intelligence outmatched brute force at every turn. The decisive battle for the soul of Neza took place in an abandoned market, a labyrinth of rusted metal stalls. El Carnicero, lured into a trap, brought the bulk of his forces, expecting a final bloody confrontation. But José Luis wasn't there to fight on equal terms. He used the terrain to his advantage, funneling his enemy's men into dead-end alleys where they were picked off by snipers positioned by El Cholo. It was a tactical massacre. By the end, El Carnicero's army was shattered, and the leader himself, wounded and abandoned by most of his men, was forced to retreat, humiliated. With this victory, José Luis took control of almost the entire territory. He didn't celebrate. He just observed the trail of destruction his revenge had caused. He had become a warlord, a feared and respected criminal leader. The transformation was nearly complete. The man who once only wanted a small haven of peace now controlled a nascent empire, built on the corpses of those who had wronged him. He sat in his new headquarters, the silence around him, heavy with the power he had won. Only one last ghost needed to be exorcised. The final confrontation with El Carnicero was no longer a matter of strategy, but of destiny. With El Carnicero's empire in ruins, only the final hunt remained. José Luis knew his enemy was now a wounded animal, hiding in the shadows, dangerous and unpredictable. A simple hunt and execution wouldn't be enough. Revenge needed a stage, a closing ritual. Using one of his informants, he sent a message to El Carnicero, a meeting face-to-face, no armies. The chosen location was deliberate and cruelly poetic, the same vacant lot where his partner's body had been found. He would turn the altar of his suffering into his tormentor's tomb, forcing him to confront the origin point of all the carnage. It was an invitation to a final dance, and he knew his enemy's wounded pride would not let him refuse. The night of the confrontation was cold and starless. The vacant lot was plunged into almost complete darkness. Broken only by the headlights of a single car, José Luis's. The atmosphere was heavy, charged with the memory of that terrible night. This time, however, the scene was not deserted. Hidden in the shadows among the rubble and metal carcasses, El Cholo and his most loyal men were in position, an invisible safety net with strict orders not to intervene unless absolutely necessary. José Luis got out of the car and stood in the center of the lot, his heart beating to a controlled, deadly rhythm. He was no longer the victim who had wept on this ground. He was the master of ceremonies for this spectacle of death. El Carnicero emerged from the shadows, his imposing figure now stooped by defeat, but his eyes still burning with a savage hatred. The confrontation began with a torrent of insults, the only weapon he had left. He spat homophobic slurs, trying to diminish José Luis, trying to re-establish the old order where he was the predator and José Luis the prey. But the words had no effect. José Luis remained silent, letting his enemy's hatred echo in the void. When El Carnicero finally fell silent, panting, José Luis spoke, his voice calm and sharp as broken glass. He didn't return the insults. Instead, he began to dissect his enemy's downfall, pointing out every mistake, every failure, every predictable move, like a teacher explaining a lesson to a child. The great turning point, the psychological coup de grace, came next. With a terrifying tranquility, José Luis revealed how El Carnicero's own homophobia had been his ruin. "Your hatred made you blind," he said. "You were so obsessed with seeing me as a freak, as something weak, that you could never see me as a threat. You underestimated me because you couldn't conceive that someone like me could have intelligence, strategy, or courage. All your power was a performance for other men like you, and I used that need of yours to appear strong to destroy you." In that instant, El Carnicero understood. He had not been defeated by a larger army or a common betrayal, but by a man who had turned the poison of his prejudice into a lethal weapon. That revelation broke what was left of El Carnicero's spirit. With a roar of pure animalistic fury, he lunged at José Luis, abandoning any pretense of control. The fight was brutal, an explosion of desperate violence. El Carnicero was stronger, his blows were like sledgehammers, but they were clumsy, driven by blind hatred. José Luis, more agile and precise, dodged and counterattacked with cold efficiency. Every blow he landed was not just physical, but charged with the weight of his loss, with the memory of his love. It was the macabre dance of intelligence against brute force, of calculated revenge against irrational fury, and with every second the tide turned in favor of the new king of Neza. Finally, with a swift and precise move, he disarmed him and knocked him to the ground. El Carnicero was on the floor, wounded, panting, at his mercy. This was the moment that had fueled his dreams and nightmares. The choice. Revenge demanded suffering, a mirror of the cruelty inflicted upon him. Power, however, demanded something else. Looking down at the pathetic man at his feet, José Luis made his final decision. There would be no torture, no spectacle of pain that would make him equal to the monster he had destroyed. Instead, his act was quick, impersonal, almost surgical, an execution. It was the decision of a drug lord eliminating a threat, not a lover avenging a death. In that final act, he shed the last remnant of his former identity. The sound of the shot echoed and then dissipated into the oppressive silence of the night. José Luis stood over his enemy's body, the gun still warm in his hand. The flame of vengeance, which had consumed and driven him for so long, finally went out, leaving behind only ashes and an overwhelming cold. He had won. Justice, in its own twisted way, had been served. He was the undisputed power in Nezahualcóyotl. But the victory brought no peace, no relief, only the grim realization of the emptiness that stretched before him. And there, in that silence, I understood the truth about revenge. It gives you a purpose, but it steals your soul in the process. If my journey thus far has shown you anything, I ask you to subscribe. Continuing to tell this story is a way of ensuring that the cost of every battle is not forgotten. With the death of El Carnicero, a new era, silent and brutally efficient, descended upon Nezahualcóyotl. José Luis did not rule with the chaos and sadism of his predecessor, but with the cold precision of a strategist. The fear he inspired came not from outbursts of violence, but from the certainty of his ruthless intelligence. He brought an order to the underworld, an armed peace where the rules were clear, and the punishment for breaking them was swift and final. He had, in fact, created the safe environment he had longed for, a territory where his own were protected. However, this safety was that of a gilded cage, forged with the blood of his enemies and the ashes of his own soul. He was the king of a graveyard, the sovereign of a kingdom of ghosts. The power he had won isolated him completely. El Cholo, now his loyal second-in-command, treated him with a formal reverence that built a wall between them. The camaraderie born in the fire of battle had solidified into the rigid hierarchy of a boss and his subordinate. The distance with La Flaca was even more painful. She visited him rarely, and their meetings were filled with a heavy silence and unspoken words. In her eyes, he no longer saw the friend she had loved, but the reflection of the monster he had become in order to survive. He was surrounded by soldiers and servants, by men who feared his name, but he was profoundly, irremediably alone. The throne he built had no room for anyone else. Revenge, once consummated, did not bring him the peace he expected. On the contrary, the silence that followed the death of his final target was filled with the echoes of his own violence. The memory of his partner was no longer a flame that drove him, but a ghost that judged him. He found himself haunted not just by the image of his lost love, but by the man he was before it all began, a man capable of tenderness, of hope, of love. Now those feelings were like a foreign language he could no longer speak. The power, the respect, and the security he fought so hard to achieve seemed like empty trophies, unable to fill the abyss that his journey of hatred had carved into his chest. The final scene of his story is not one of glory, but of monumental loneliness. He is in a luxurious office, at the top of one of the few tall buildings that dot the landscape of Neza, looking out over the infinite sea of lights that stretches below. The city that oppressed him, that took everything from him, now lies at his feet. He is the supreme power, the shadow that controls all other shadows. He wears the crown, but as he looks at his reflection in the window glass, he sees not a king, but a prisoner, a hardened man, perpetually trapped by the past, ruling an empire that cost him the only thing that ever truly mattered. The crown of Nezahualcóyotl was, as it had always been, a crown of thorns. The story of José Luis ends here, at the top of a world he conquered, only to find himself completely alone. He became the dark mirror of what he swore to destroy, leaving us with the bitter question of whether it's possible to fight the darkness without being consumed by it. I thank you immensely for following this complex journey to the end. The subscription and support of each of you is the strength that allows us to continue exploring these difficult truths, sharing accounts that, like his, force us to look into the abyss. Your presence here ensures these stories are not forgotten. Thank you so much for listening.